Chapter 9. Flo, Harry Biggar, Truck Accident 1946, Hunting 1950. I should mention the fun Flo had building. She built houses with anything that was available, from curtain poles and sheets to lumber and bales of hay, on the lawn, the bed, the haymow, or the backyard. Her greatest pleasure came from the inspection we had after each building was completed. Tom had his fair share of the fun from the same game. Let's go to 1946. At this time, Joe Gerard was working for us and living in the spare house. He had 3 sons, Joe Jr., Bill, and the youngest, Dawn, and a daughter, Edna, between Bill and Dawn. Edna was a year or so older than Flo and a very nice person. In fact, I thought so much of her that I bought a used bicycle for her at the same time we bought one for Flo, so that she could ride with Flo to school. Dawn was a source of trouble from the word go. There was no way to keep up with his mischievous nature. He put a woolen rag in my truck gas tank that took 2 years to get out. He deliberately kicked out about 20 of the rungs in the veranda railing just for something to do. What a kid. Harry Biggar was in the frozen pie cherry business and operated from a small barn at the back of his house on Glover's Road, about 300 yards from the lake shore. Mr. Biggar was a good business head with a real gambling spirit. His hobby was trotting horses, and he raised and trained a few that made a mark in the sport both in Canada and the U.S. He was pretty sharp and loved to wheel and deal. Alex Glover, who lived on No. 8 Highway east of Glover's Road, a relative of the Stewarts, the Deans, and the Biggars, was constantly trying to get ahead of Mr. Biggar on whatever deal they could cook up. It happened that Alex had bought a small Jersey cow that he learned would produce about half the amount of milk he expected. He called Harry and told him to come and see the wonderful cow he had just bought. He said he was just on his way to milk it, and he would be glad to let him watch. As soon as he hung up the phone, he selected the largest pail he could find and filled it a little past half with water. When Harry arrived, Alex was still milking and bragging about the beautiful cow. Harry just had to have that cow, and after a fair amount of dickering, he bought it. Alex made sure the news was all over the neighborhood, all about how he had beaten Harry in a deal. I never heard if Harry ever got even, but it is my guess he did. Harry bought all the cherries we could produce for as long as we were in business. Isabel, Harry's daughter, helped with management and sales until Harry's health failed in the early 50s, when they sold the business to Harold Smith in Vineland. It was the last load to be delivered for the 46th season, so the date must have been the first part of August. I put the 50 or so 11-quart baskets on the old Model A, Tom in the cab with me and Flo, and Edna in the back with the cherries. I drove on DeWitt Road to the Queen Elizabeth, turned right, and proceeded towards Glover's Road. As I approached Glover's Road, I noticed 3 girls standing at the intersection on the median. The only turn signal in those days was an extended left arm. Only the more expensive cars were equipped with a tail light turn signals, not any of the trucks. After glancing in the rearview mirror and seeing no approaching cars, I extended my arm, slowed considerably, and moved over to the left until I straddled the middle of the 2 lanes. I know now I should have been completely in the left lane, but it looked wiser at that time to remain farther to the right in order to be sure that I would not miss the standing girls. Just after I had passed the girls and my left front wheel was entering the median, a car came from right behind at high speed, hit the girls, and drove them at least 75 feet past me. The car showed no signs of trying to stop, but proceeded across the median to hit a car head-on in the westbound lane. I had been preparing to stop on the median before proceeding across the westbound lane, so it is more than likely that my truck had moved very few feet after the girls were hit. Few seconds passed before I was beside the nearest girl, who was asking for help for her 2 friends. Others were on the scene nearly as quickly as myself, and someone called for an ambulance and the police. 1 girl was killed, and the other 2 were taken to the hospital. In spite of severe damage to the cars in the collision, none of the passengers were seriously hurt. I was later told that the passenger with the man who drove the 31 Model A that did all the damage was escorted away from the scene before the police arrived because he was too drunk to stand. In spite of the fact that the driver had been drinking and driving at excessive speed, it was impossible to convince myself in my own mind that I was not partly responsible for the girl's death. For many years, I could vividly see those girls flying through the air, hear the cries for help, and visualize the crumpled, bleeding bodies lying on the grass of the median. I was well represented at the trial by Mr. Balby, a lawyer whose father was once the minister at the church in Tapley Town before 1900. It was proved that the driver had been drinking, in fact, was a habitual drinker, and yet no criminal charges were laid against him, and my insurance company paid part of the claims. It was at least gratifying to know that the father of the two girls, Mr. Nyland, held no feelings of animosity towards me. I must have been the first to have turning signals on a truck. 2 3-inch red lights, mounted as far apart as possible on the rear end of the truck, were operated manually by 2 separate switches. There were no flicker units, so it was necessary to push and pull the switch to simulate a flashing light. Very crude, but effective. It was a little tricky working the switch with one hand held while negotiating a corner with the other, unless you were lucky enough to have a passenger who would do it for you. The production of farm machinery in 1947 had not caught up to the demand, and in order to purchase new equipment, it was necessary to place an order about 6 months in advance of the time it was needed. Stan Lytle, a neighbor who had married Cliff Jerome's sister Helen, approached me to ask for help to buy a new tractor, disc and plow, which we needed desperately. He knew I was connected with Ford through Frank Batters and assumed that I might have some drag. I was not obligated to Stan in any way, and told him that I would not ask favors without a special reason. The conversation finally got around to whether I could get a tractor for myself, and I replied that I could only try. He very anxiously volunteered to buy my used tractor disc and plow, and paid me whatever it cost me to replace them, an offer one could hardly refuse, considering that my equipment was already 8 years old. I contacted the Ford dealer in Grimsby, Mr. Shantz, who informed me the wait might be closer to 8 months, and I got a real hee-haw when I asked if I could run the deal through him if it were possible to have a tractor shipped to him. He was more than happy to oblige. When I called Frank at the office and explained the situation, he said, "Leave it with me, and I will get back to you as soon as I know." To my surprise, Frank called before the day had passed to inform me that the new tractor, disc and plow, were on the way and should be delivered in less than a week. Something like 5 days later, they arrived in Grimsby, all tagged, "Rush, special order," stamped all over them. You may well imagine the service I received from that dealer. Nothing was too much trouble to accommodate such an important customer, and he will never know how I swung the deal. The equipment cost Stan slightly over $1,400, and that tractor served me faithfully for all the remaining years of my farm life, or until the auction sale of all the equipment in July of 1973. After 25 years of nearly continuous use, it brought $700, and the plow sold for $130. The disc had been traded several years previously on a John Deere disc of superior weight and quality. In the fall of 1950, Lauren Lee made all the arrangements for us to hunt at Heritage Lake Lodge, a summer lodge located 5 miles south of Temagami, or 65 miles north of North Bay on No. 11 highway. Lauren and Alan Lee, Lauren's son, Laverne Jim Corman, Elmer Wilson, Ralph Hill, and myself made a twice easy-to-manage party of 7. Our hunting area was about 3 miles away, which we traveled to by boat. We came out of a nice warm cabin after breakfast every morning, climbed into the boat, and nearly froze to death before we arrived at our destination. After walking all day, working up a good sweat and a mild case of exhaustion, we piled high in the boat and froze all the way back to camp. That system is for the birds. The cabins were built for summer use and were all small. Insulation was nil, so until we lit the wood fire in the morning, the temperature inside and out was exactly the same. Jim, Ralph, Elmer, and myself shared one cabin, and the remaining 3 shared a second cabin. They were only a short distance apart, so we ate and played cards in our cabin and used the second for sleeping only. We had a good hunt in spite of a few disadvantages, like green firewood and a second-rate cook stove. We certainly had our fair share of laughs at minor instances that occurred during the season. Game was not plentiful, but we had all we really wanted to take home. I won the proverbial pot of $1 apiece for the first deer shot, and there were 2 other deer to add to the take. The last night in camp came, and we settled everything between us financially, broke out the bottle, and proceeded to celebrate the season. Alan, Laverne, and myself left the bottle to the rest, and there were enough to get them flying high. Ralph supplied most of the entertainment, trying to walk on top of the 7-foot-high partitions in the cabin. About 2:30 a.m., we stoked the fire and climbed into bed. It must have been nearly 4 o'clock a.m. when Ralph woke with a bang and asked, "What in hell's going on here?" He was loud and clear, and this woke his bedfellow, Jim, who answered just as loud, "The place is on fire! Cliff! Elmer! Wake up!" I woke to see a little ball of fire in the peak of the roof, about 2 feet in diameter. Excitement reigned supreme. We were all on our feet within seconds. Each had his own idea of a cure for the problem. Jim had noticed a fire extinguisher in the main lodge, which was about 40 yards away, a few days before. Ralph remembered he had parked his half-ton Chev truck within a few feet of the west wall of the cabin. I figured with the help of the other 3 men in the other cabin, we could easily extinguish the fire. Elmer decided to go back to the bedroom for his pants, a matter of 6 or 8 feet away from where we stood dazedly watching the fireball getting bigger. Simultaneously, the only seconds after the first warning from Ralph, we all filed out the only door, Jim first, Ralph second, and me in close pursuit, and Elmer about 8 feet behind. It must have been when Jim opened the door, a gush of fresh air ignited nearly all of the cabin at once, because when I looked back from 10 feet in front of the cabin, the whole inside was fire, and Elmer was falling out through the screen door. He just didn't have time to open it. It took 6 months to heal the blisters on the back of his ears and grow enough hair to look respectable. There was an inch of snow on the ground and the temperature was well below freezing, so, in bare feet, it didn't take me long to get to the other cabin. Lorne, Alan, and Laverne pulled on their boots, grabbed a pail, and in less time than it takes to tell, we were all running towards the lake. There was an inch of ice on the water, and it could not be broken by stamping close to the shore. The bank was steep, and by the time Lorne was far enough out to break the ice, he went in over his knees in ice and cold water. In the meantime, Ralph was sitting in his truck, trying desperately to get it started. It turned over rather slowly. In fact, by the time it started, both his feet were frozen to the pedals. The filler cap of the gas tank pointed directly towards the raging fire, and there were a few anxious moments before the truck finally started. By the time we reached the fire with the first pail of water, there was nothing standing more than a foot high. Shells were exploding, sparks were flying, and there was absolutely nothing left. The building could not have burned faster, even if it had been made of wax paper. We all stood helplessly by, watching all our belongings, except the pajamas we were wearing, turn to ashes. Lorne, Alan, and Laverne had plenty of spare clothes, but unfortunately, they were about half the size of those who had none. When we left for home, we looked as though we were dressed for Halloween. My pants were donated to me by the man of whom we had rented the cabin, well-worn and faded summer pants, which I had held up with a piece of rope. Alan loaned me rubber boots and a black turtleneck sweater. Even though I stretched that sweater 6 sizes larger, the sleeves were above my wrists, and it would not pull far enough down to cover my rope belt. The others were dressed comparably, and it is too bad nobody cared about taking a picture. Daybreak came shortly after 8 o'clock a.m., and after an hour's search through the ashes, we found the keys to Jim's Studebaker. We loaded the truck with the other fellow's gear and the 3 deer and took off. I rode with Ralph, and we bitterly laminated our many losses all the way to North Bay. Licenses, money, wallets, guns, clothing, blankets, etc., all gone. A doctor in North Bay patched Elmer up with well enough to take him home. Then, as we gradually recovered from the shock and began to realize how lucky we were to be alive, the disappointment of our losses slowly faded to their proper proportions with every mile. Ralph was the only one who had a floater policy, so he was reimbursed the full amount of his losses. The rest of us collected to the extent of 10% of the insurance we each carried on household goods. When you tabulate all the stuff that goes on a hunt trip, it is amazing how high the total value really becomes. I received $400 from the insurance company and lost about $100 besides the cash in my wallet. Nobody was interested in going back to Heritage Lake Lodge to hunt again. I realize this record is neither complete nor entirely accurate, but possibly someday I will straighten a few things out and rearrange the events in their proper sequence. For instance, Ralph Hill read the account of the fire at the hunt camp and pointed out a few errors. Ralph says Elmer went back for his pants, and when he attempted to come out again, he was pulling the door instead of pushing it. It was Ralph who pulled from the outside to gain Elmer his freedom. It was the small screened-in porch which Elmer fell through, not the screen door. In any case, Ralph agrees that a few seconds' delay in his awakening would have spelled curtains for us all. End of chapter 9.